Okay, guys, we're getting towards the end here. Chapter 16 is called Flight by Night. As she ran toward the woods, Laura's first thought was how easy it was to run without skirts. Boys were certainly lucky. Martin reached the shadow of the maple tree almost as soon as she did. Then they paused. She was about to make a dash for the woods when she heard the clop-clop of horses' hooves on the road. A horse and rider came into view from the direction of Lewiston. Soon they were joined by the sentry Laura had seen patrolling the road in front of the house. Scarcely breathing, she and Martin waited while the men talked, looking often toward the Eastman house. If the men glanced toward the backyard, they would see two who were standing in the shadow. Would they see two who were standing in the shadow of the maple? Laura thought not. She and Martin were wearing dark clothes, and Martin had the added advantage of a dark-skinned face. Moving cautiously, she pulled her cap low over her forehead and lifted the collar of the jacket to hide as much as possible of her white skin. After the longest 5 minutes of her life, the men parted. The one on horseback traveling toward Lewiston, and the other walking east. As soon as the sentry's back was turned, she and Martin fled toward the woods. Once under the cover of the trees, Laura paused to catch her breath. "Stay close to me," she warned Martin again. "We mustn't get separated. Hang on to the back of my jacket." She started toward slowly with the lantern in one hand and holding the other hand outstretched. A branch scraped harshly across her face, and she came to a sudden halt, clutching her cap to keep from losing it. Martin, close on her heels, bumped into her. "I can't see a thing," she whispered. "I wish I dared light this lantern." "Let me carry it," Martin suggested. Then you can use two hands to fight off those branches." They started forward again. It was easy, Laura found, now that she had both hands free. Also, as the time went on, her eyes became more accustomed to the dark, and soon she could see the black trunks of maple and beech and oak and the furry clumps of pine and spruce. She began to regain the confidence she'd once had when in the woods. Now and then a slight tug on the back of her jacket told her that Martin was with her. The ridge road was on their left, and from the start she tried to bear in that direction. By now she should have reached it. Were they lost already? Surely not. Not in these woods she had once known so well. Then, to her relief, she heard the rumble of a carriage wheels not far off. Martin pulled at her jacket, as she knew he, too, had heard the carriage. Moving toward the sound, she saw ahead of her the white band of the road, gleaming dimly in the starlight. Seconds later, a horse and carriage came into view, traveling at a quick pace. Even in the faint light, Laura recognized the horse. It was Sally. Someone was on the carriage seat, leaning forward to urge the horse on, but Laura couldn't make out his features. The carriage passed the two hiding in the woods, and Laura was about to move on when a horse and rider came pell-mell down the road after the carriage. She heard the rider shout, "Hello! Where are you going?" A voice answered from the carriage, "Down the road a piece. What business is it of yours?" "That looks to me like the Eastman carriage, the one that kidnapped the runaways this afternoon." "That it is," the man in the carriage admitted. "It turned up on Center Street not half an hour ago, so the sheriff asked me if I'd take it back to where it belongs. No one's home at the Eastman's place but the girl, and she's asleep. Sam's been watching the house ever since young Bert was picked up. The light went out in her room some time back." Sam must be the sentry who had been patrolling the road in front of the house, Laura decided. "I heard about Bert," said the man in the carriage. "Well, I'll put this rig in the barn and I'll give the horse a bag of oats. No need to wake the girl." Laura leaned against a tree, waiting while the horse and rider cantered past on their way back to Lewiston. Martin whispered, "Too bad we can't get that carriage to ride to the river." "I wish we could, but we're safer in the woods. Too many people were abroad tonight," Laura thought. "The carriage would surely be stopped before they could reach Tyrant's Folly." "I know," Martin agreed. "Well, we'd better move on." Keeping the ridge road sight on the left, they pushed ahead, making good time until they neared a farmhouse. At their approach, the farmer's dog set up such a racket that his owner came out to investigate. The dog ran directly toward the woods where Laura and Martin were standing, afraid to stir lest the crackle of dry leaves and branches betray them still farther. They could hear the man call, "Come back here, Rupert. I'm not chasing after any porcupines or skunks tonight." But Rupert was persistent, and finally the farmer gave in, saying, "All right, you win. I'll get my gun." Hearing this, Laura and Martin waited only until the farmer entered the house for his gun. Then they ran as fast as they could. In spite of her fright, Laura tried to keep her bearings. Their only hope was to stay in sight of the road. Although her memory of the land around Lewiston was coming back to her, she knew she couldn't find her way deep in the woods at night. The barking of the dog proved to be a guide as well as a spur, for it helped Laura to lead the way in a wide circle around the farm. She and Martin pushed on until they fell to the ground completely out of breath. When the pounding of blood in her ears stopped, Laura listened for the dog, but silence had descended on the woods. "Now I know how you felt with the bloodhounds after you," she told Martin. "They're worse," he said. "They make that awful howling noise, and you know they never give up." Martin sat up and examined the lantern, to which he had clung all through their wild flight. "It's still whole," he said. Laura struggled slowly to her feet and walked unsteadily to the edge of the nearby clearing. "We've come around to the north of Lewiston," she said. Mohawk Street is over there." She pointed to the left. "So if we go straight ahead, we should reach the river." She didn't want Martin to guess how worried she was. The trip was taking longer than she had expected. What if the boat had already come and gone by the time they reached Tyrant's Folly? In a few minutes they came onto the river road across from Judge Stowe's estate. Laura felt encouraged. This last part of their trip had gone quickly. "We're almost there," she said softly. "Praise be," answered Martin. They hurried north in the shelter of the trees, for Laura did not dare to cross the road at this point. Judge Stowe's land was too open for safety. When the dark mass of woods near Tyrant's Folly lay opposite them, she whispered, "We'll cross there." The road was empty in both directions, so she scurried over with Martin beside her. They had barely reached the other side when hoofbeats clattered out of the drive of Judge Stowe's and came down the road toward Tyrant's Folly. Martin dropped to the ground and lay motionless, while Laura crouched beside him. Now the horse and rider were approaching more slowly. Laura could see a piebald horse, and atop him the tall shape of Walt. Had he seen them dash across the road? To Laura's relief, Walt continued down the road with a whispered word to Martin. She stood up. Stepping cautiously, she led the way through the thick undergrowth until they reached the comparative openness of the lane. Here she paused to listen, and with dismay and fear, she heard the crashing sound of someone hurrying through the woods behind them. Walt must have seen them after all. Laura could think of only one thing. She must get Martin to the river before the slave hunter caught up with them. "Come on," she urged. Martin obeyed, and in 2 or 3 minutes they burst out of the woods into the narrow clearing around Tyrant's Folly. Without a backward glance, Laura ran headlong toward the house. Martin's feet pounded after her, and together they dashed into the parlor. Bats whirred over their heads, so close that Laura could feel the air stirred by their flight. But she had no time to be afraid of mere winged creatures. By the dim light that came through the high windows, she rushed through the rooms to the kitchen. She flung open the door to the cellar. "Here are the stairs. Put your hand on the railing." The darkness seemed to reach up to smother them. Laura felt as if she were descending into a well. Behind her, Martin gasped, "Where are you?" "Here." She tried to sound calm. "Give me the lantern." She placed it on the floor, pulling a lucifer from her pocket, and struck it. In the flare, she could see to open the lantern and touch the wick with the flame. She jumped to her feet, crossed to the door and in the west wall, then pulled it toward her. Ahead lay the short tunnel that slopped down to the next cellar. "Come on." She started ahead with the light. "Watch out for the stairs at the end of the tunnel." "Yes, Miss Laura," said Martin. Laura heard both fear and bravery in his voice. Just a little farther, she encouraged him. You'll soon be crossing the river. They were in the second cellar, and Martin had the trap door raised when Laura, pausing to listen, heard a door open someplace upstairs. Footsteps thudded far overhead. It sounded as if more than one person was up there. Walt must have a deputy or another slave catcher with him. Laura exchanged a terrified glance with Martin. Close the trap door and hurry. She plunged down the steps, and stumbling, almost falling in her haste, frantic with excitement, she glanced desperately around the third cellar. Where is that trap door? She asked herself. Only this afternoon she had been through these cellars, but now in her panic she couldn't recall where the entrance to the next cellar was. Martin snatched the lantern from her hand and scurried around the room. In a moment he had located the trap door in the floor, beneath the windows that faced the river. Swiftly he raised the door, set the lantern on the floor, and stood aside, waiting for Laura. Go ahead, she whispered. Down there you'll find a door on the side of the cellar toward the river. Run out and hide. Martin scrambled down the ladder while Laura seized the lantern and climbed while Martin scrambled down the ladder while Laura seized the lantern and turned to climb down after him. Her foot found the top rung of the ladder, and she reached for the trap door. To her horror, she heard footsteps enter the room she was leaving. She had no time to lower the door. Below her, Martin warned, Watch out for the last rung. It's loose. Directly above her head, someone asked, Is that you, Martin? Surprised, Laura looked up into a dazzling light. The person who was holding the lantern asked in a puzzled tone, Laura? Such relief flooded through Laura that she almost lost hold of the ladder. The man in the cellar was Joel Todd. All right, guys, that was chapter 16. Tomorrow was chapter 17, which is our last chapter. All right, have a great day.